morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar hosted by Transcelerate on digital data flow, modernizing clinical trials, updates on progress, and cross-industry collaboration. I'm excited to be joined today by a team of fantastic moderators and panelists to talk about the Digital Data Flow Initiative today. We've had over 1,000 registrants for this webinar from across different geographies, including North America and Europe. So let's dive into the agenda. After some introductions today of our panelists, we will talk through an overview of digital data flow and current status of where we are today with this important initiative. We'll then spend the balance of time in a panel discussion with some panelists that we'll introduce in just a second, followed by Q&A towards the end of the call. Before we get started, just a few quick ground rules. We want to make this discussion helpful and answer as many of your questions as we can. Please note that participation in this webinar is voluntary, as is using Transcelerate assets and tools. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is owned by solution adopters, and you do not have to identify what company you work for. Things that we will not be discussing today, including what vendors, sites, CROs, customers, or clients you may be doing business with, or what services you may or may not be using, any issues with vendors, sites, CROs, tech products, or services, long-term development plans, or anything related to costs or prices. We cannot answer questions today about vendors, the cost of using or implementing Transcelerate assets or tools, or which member companies are using specific vendors, products, or Transcelerate assets and tools. Please note that all lines have been muted to ensure a pleasant listening experience for all attendees. You may reduce the GoToWebinar control panel by clicking on the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner. We welcome questions throughout the discussion. These can be submitted using the questions function you should see in your control panel. Be sure to select send after typing your question into the box. Questions that we do not get to today will be answered and included in our DDF frequently asked questions available on the Transcelerate website. The link to these facts is provided in later slides. Please also note this webinar may be recorded in whole or in part. Before we get started, we'd like to launch a quick poll asking for everyone's current understanding of the Digital Data Flow Initiative. Please respond to the poll on the screen, and I'll give everyone about 30 seconds to respond. Okay, about 5 more seconds. All right, we've got about 75% of people responding. Thank you for participating in the poll. Let's share the responses. All right, it looks like we have a fairly large portion of people who can explain digital data flows somewhat. Many others who are coming fresh to this webinar, hoping to learn more. And also a fairly significant number who can explain at a high level the scope, value, and plans for digital data flow. So really great to have a lot of people on the phone today who are looking to learn more about the initiative, and we hope to be able to answer your questions today on the call. Thank you. And now I'll pass it over to our moderator, Eleanor. Eleanor, would you like to get us started?
Yep. Hi, everyone, and just a quick sound check that I can be heard all right.
Yes, we hear you great.
All right, and then we'll go ahead and get the slides moved. As I said, my name is Eleanor Libner-Olesen, and I'll be the moderator today. We're very excited about this webinar because it's a little bit different than what we normally do, because in the fact that it's less about slides and more about discussions and the conversation. And today we have an expert panel with us. We've got representatives from across the pharma industry, as well as representatives from the tech vendor community to discuss the DDF project, the value that it brings not only to the pharma industry, but also to the stakeholders of the clinical value chain. So I'll take a minute to introduce everyone, and I'll start with Bill Illis. He's the Global Head, Collaboration and Technical Strategy in Clinical Development and Analytics at Novartis. Then I'll go to Frederick Malfay, who's the VP of Information and Architecture at NeuroCore. We have with us today Nusheen Dida. She's Senior Data Quality Lead, PD Data Sciences at Roche. We've also got from Todd Georgiev, also from Roche. He's External Engagement and Content Standards Lead. Tom Walpole is the CTO at Trials.ai. And we have Vasu Raghunathan, who's a partner at IntelliNotion. But before we go to the panel discussion, I first want to take a minute to walk us through the digital data flow, give you a quick overview for those of you who aren't so familiar with the initiative. I'll just take a little bit of time to walk us through it very briefly. And to do that, I'll start out at the very beginning, and that's with Transcelerate and who we are. It's actually a nonprofit entity of roughly 20 top pharma companies, and they work together to address key challenges in the industry, and they're dedicated to designing and coming up with new solutions that will solve the problem. And all of this is with the aim to ensure that we have efficient and effective processes and deliver high quality new medicines to patients in need. One of these solutions that we'll be talking about today is the Digital Data Flow Initiative, and that is one that aims to catalyze the digital transformation. In short, what the DDF aims to achieve in terms is a future state that comprises digitized protocols. And by enabling the use of technology that identify and assemble study elements, this allows the industry to move to digital protocols. Another ambition is connectivity of data and processes, and enabling traceability, automated flow of content to key clinical documents, and automation to clinical and operational systems would be achieved. Another ambition is to enable advanced analytics, and this is by the use, such as the use of advanced, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning to improve study designs. And last but not least, an open and flexible solution, and by developing a dynamic and fully automated solution that's vendor agnostic, open, and flexible. We've worked with some development principles to enable not only this ambition, but also the way that we do it in terms of we need to collaborate and want to collaborate with this. And those principles are that we work with the idea that what we deliver is open source and shareable, that it's vendor agnostic. We will work using agile development methodologies and have a dynamic alignment to standards. And in terms of where we are quickly approaching our minimal viable product, and that's ongoing on way right now. Where the expected delivery time is April of this year. And what will be contained in this MVP is that the focus is on enabling the flow, that digital flow of study definitions data from the study builders to the study definitions repository, or SDR, to electronic data capture, or CDMS systems. So the DDF MVP is actually a reference implementation of a novel central component to manage the data flow SDR. This reference implementation, or SDR, is going to be enabled or used with the CDIS developed data and CDIS API. And there it will connect with upstream vendors, study builders connections, and then also downstream with EDC. We've got a couple of our participating solution providers with us on this call from the study builder side, and that's IntelliNotion, Trials.ai, and NeuroCore. So all this leads us to where are we now and what's next in this journey. As I mentioned before, we're working very hard and fast approaching the time when we'll deliver our MVP. But of course, we won't stop there. And that's part of the beauty of working agile, is that you continuously learn and deliver value as you learn and adopt and continue on that development. After the MVP release in Q2, you can look forward to a public connectathon in late Q2, Q3, where that will be all about an open connectathon, as it's called, to have other vendor providers to see if they can connect and see what they can do. And of course, we're not stopping there. We will continue the dialogue with Study Builder and EDC vendors and get their input into the technical solution, the USDM and the STR and so on. We'll continue to work on that digitized protocol. That's right now enabled by elements of the common protocol template. And this, we can see it significantly facilitates an automated protocol development. And also focus again on the EDC integration. These are components that are a part of the MVP, and we continue to work on that going forward. So that's where we are today. If you're asking yourself, well, this sounds really cool, and it does, and you want to know, how do I keep updated with what's going on, and how do I engage with DDF? There is a lot going. There's also a lot of places where you can go to get some information. So I'll just call out a few of them. The first one, CDIS Public Review and Webinar, that's coming up here this month. You can also go back on the CDIS site. There's a link here to the webinar that they held when they called out for volunteers in October of 2021. There's some very good information there about DDF as well. We've also got the DDF GitHub launch for open source collaboration that's coming up as well. And that's basically going to be a community and a place for further development there. I've already mentioned the DDF Connectathon that's coming up later this year. Also, Transcelerate has a lot of information where you can go and find out more. So if you need to remember anything about these slides, then remember this, that you can just go to Transcelerate DDF Solutions webpage. There you can find FAQs, you can find previously recorded webinars. This one will be there as well. You can also sign up to get information sent to you on the DDF information form. An overview, there's some material about the overview, there's videos and so on and so forth. So there's quite a bit of information there for you that you can reach out and find out more. On that note, we'll stop and we'll head to our panel where we're going to discuss the DDF vision and the progress that we are, and also a bit about the cross-industry collaboration. I'm going to start with you, Bill. So you've had a little bit of a heads up there, and we'll jump into it. So could you start with kind of a broad question and give us the vision? What is the vision and Transcelerate's perspective on the DDF and what it's solving for?
Yeah, happy to do so, Eleanor. Thanks a lot. The vision really starts with a saying that you often hear around these days, mostly virtual halls of Transcelerate, which says, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. More specifically, our vision, as Eleanor summarized, is to modernize clinical trials by enabling a true industry-wide and common digital workflow to allow for the automation of study assets, configuration of study systems, and to support clinical trial execution in a modern digital way. We want to move away from the current state, which is many different proprietary, non-standard solutions to this problem, and work towards one common solution for the clinical trials industry. In addition to the digital automation, we also envision a common industry-wide basis for innovation in study design from insights based on analytics developed from a common study definition or protocol data model that we're calling the Unified Study Definitions Model. That's the part that's being developed by CDISC as a new standard. I would say fundamentally we're working to free the data. The data is currently locked up in relatively unstructured protocol documents, and we want to free that data, and in doing so, improve the way clinical studies are designed and executed. We're of course not going to accomplish this all in one release or in a short period of time. And an important part of our vision is establishing a foundation for collaboration across stakeholders. That includes Transcelerate members, but also other pharma-based study sponsors, academic study sponsors, clinical site organizations, CROs, health authorities, clinical systems vendors, standard setting organizations, systems integrators, and so on. All stakeholders in the clinical development space that are involved with study design, study startup activities, really we'd like to involve here. As Eleanor mentioned, the initial objective is to automate and expedite the study startup process by really changing and transforming how the data flows work across those three primary components she showed on the earlier slide: upstream systems, study builders, or digital protocol authoring tools that produce the digitized study definitions and protocol. Downstream systems, we're focused on EDC, CDMS in our first release now, but these are the systems that consume digitized protocol information as part of their configuration to run a study, to start the study, and execute the processes of the clinical trial. And the part we're doing then is in the middle of all that, the study, what we call the study definitions repository, reference implementation, which we believe is a unique central component that will really show and demonstrate the technology standards and the data standards to manage the flow of information and give a real basis to exchange this information in a common way, building interoperability across the different components in this industry-wide system. So this would transform drug development processes from a current state of manual study startup, where study design information is manually and repeatedly re-entered and rewritten many times, and transform us to a modern digital state, a state we should be in, but we haven't progressed over 10, 15 years now, a state where structured clinical study design data is captured once, reused many times to support the automation and setup of study execution activities. The other element of our vision for DDF is that it encompasses what we are delivering, so new protocol data standard, API-based data repository and exchange solution, but it also significantly encompasses how we're working, specifically developing and releasing an agnostic solution, one that doesn't favor any technologies or vendors over others, and that can be used by all stakeholders. And in addition, releasing our solution under an open source license, and our intention is to build a community of contributing collaborators to further advance the solution with new and innovative capabilities. In reference to that, we envision to build a sustained community of partners who are contributing feedback, ideas, methods, refinements, and solutions. So at a very basic level, I would summarize our vision related to the use of study protocol data is creating this foundation and the environment for stakeholders in clinical development to go together, work together, and to go far, and to advance the transformation into the digital age and build interoperability for our industry and clinical development.
Thank you for that. That's actually a really ambitious vision, and I can, just knowing some of the conversations, similar conversations that I think I've had in the industry about that, I'm curious to hear, how did this go from vision to being an actual initiative or project at Transcelerate?
There's a long history, Eleanor, in that has led us to the point we're at today. And DDF in particular is building on a consistent body of work at Transcelerate starting almost 10 years ago, with joint work between CDISC and Transcelerate to accelerate the development of clinical data standards, which is in many ways is also foundational to what we're doing today. That was specifically followed up by work at Transcelerate, which many of the audience might be familiar with, around the common protocol template. And this was based on a simple idea that greater commonality across the industry relating to protocol structure and content will enable the entire clinical trial ecosystem to capture significant efficiencies. And by and large, that's been realized with the release of the template, which came out 5-6 years ago, and has been adopted by many Transcelerate members and many outside the Transcelerate membership. This also initiated a journey towards digitization of the study protocol. And the follow-on to the template itself was the so-called eCPT, sometimes called the technology-enabled edition of the Common Protocol template. And this then progressed into the current clinical content and reuse workstream, which is a sister workstream to digital data flow running at Transcelerate, which has tackled the reuse of content in a document framework from study protocols to statistical analysis plans and clinical study reports. So there's been a progression over a number of years building towards what we're doing in digital data flow. I would say despite these initial advances and progress, there's still a lack of protocol and study definition data and technical exchange standards to build on the interoperability. And that's an important barrier to the industry-wide digital transformation that we're seeking. This, of course, led us to the Digital Data Flow Initiative, which was launched over 3 years ago now and aims to break that document paradigm and create the foundation for the industry to move to a fuller set of digitization and really modernize the way we can exchange data in a digital structure. I would also cite 4 specific drivers for the DDF initiative. The first one being out of the Common Protocol Template Initiative, there was a POC run around towards the end of 2018, which demonstrated the possibilities in a very tangible way, a very concrete way of further digitization. The second element I would cite is the advancement of digital protocol authoring tools, and we have 3 leading vendors in that space with us today, I'm glad to say. But the advancement of these tools over the last few years has started to shift the reliance from unstructured information towards a much more structured, digitized representation of the study protocol, and that's key to the transformation that we're seeking. Third element I would cite is the maturity of data standards, processes, and the usage of standards in clinical development in general has progressively increased over the past, I would say, even 15 to 20 years. That's been a constant upward curve. And in early 2019, there was a consensus recommendation, which some of you may be aware of, from the CDISC Blue Ribbon Commission, calling for the development of a machine-readable protocol data standard. So we're following a consistent kind of progression of developments and thought in that standard space. And finally, the fourth element I would cite on the technology side is that the understanding and use of API-based systems architectures and designs has improved. The REST APIs, representational state transfer APIs, grew to be the most used API pattern around 2015, 2016. And it's a design that's lightweight, easy to learn, easy to use, and versus other much more complex API design patterns that were dominant previously. So for these reasons, we believe the time is right to work on what we're doing, the consistent representation of study metadata and standardized methods to exchange that data among producers and consumers of the same information. That's exactly what we're doing through the development of standards being led by CDISC in the form of the Unified Study Definitions Model and exchange standards, and in the form of API specifications, which are also part of that standards delivery. Also, we believe the time is right to demonstrate the use of these standards in a model implementation and a technical solution to exchange this metadata between producing and consuming systems. This is what we're doing with our development partners, Accenture and Microsoft, and our connecting system vendors, some of whom I'm glad to say are panelists on this webinar today. We'll hear from them in just a minute. So the immediate next steps in our journey, as Eleanor mentioned, are the MVP release coming next month and the planned Connectathon event. We're excited and optimistic about the progress we're making. And in addition, we're developing now plans for future releases and a longer-term roadmap, including additional types of downstream systems and use cases. So you can see here, there's a consistent history and progression. We're making progress, we're developing, we're inviting others to be part of the community. And through this webinar, we're looking to enlarge that space and have more of you also participating and joining our efforts to reach this goal.
Thanks for that, Bill. I'm actually going to follow up on some of the things you said and bring in some of the tech vendor side. And I'm going to start with you, Frederick. So it's actually, even though there's been a lot of development and standards are starting to mature, it's still relatively early in some ways. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about you. What is your perspective on joining in this initiative, actually as one of the earlier ones? And I'd like to hear what your thoughts are about that. Why so early?
Yeah, what may sound early is for us actually not early. So Nurecore started development work on a study builder and protocol platform solution about 3, maybe 4 years ago. And in the beginning, we actually had sometimes the feeling maybe we're leaning too far out of the window or starting too early. But then things really changed with the DDF publication of the white paper and the DDF hackathon. So that's where we really got confirmation that we were executing on the right vision, but more importantly also that the industry could start shifting and get ready to embrace change, which is, I think, a very big component of this whole thing. Now with DDF moving to the next stage of actually building an MVP for an SDR, it really was a no-brainer for us to stay engaged, not to get engaged, but to stay engaged and keep doing what we're already doing, but now with some additional considerations. So I would say early, but also continued engagement allows Nurecore to keep our vision, roadmap, and product capabilities aligned with DDF in a timely fashion, but then conversely also to make suggestions and contribute from our side to the DDF vision and roadmap, particularly in demonstrating that this idea and vision is not something that you can put on slides or on paper, but that the technology is actually ready today to actually execute on this. So with the momentum that the DDF hackathon has provided and the prospect to establish industry standards, which is also a component of the SDR, and for Nurecore to then become part of that ecosystem, made it really an obvious choice for us to become a connecting vendor in the SDR project.
Thank you. And then I think I'll just hand over and repeat the same question to you, Tom. What are your thoughts? Why were you guys also interested in being early involved, or being involved early, I should say?
Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks for having us as part of the panel. We've had kind of a similar experience to Frederick and Nurecore. We started several years ago. And our business is to provide technology that helps sponsors produce optimal protocols. And so naturally, we have followed the work that Transcelerate has been doing over the years. And when we became aware of the DDF hackathon and corresponding project, it just made sense for us to be a part of it. I won't deny that, practically speaking, as a startup, it's been a way for us to kind of flex our expertise and gain some visibility into the industry. However, on a more personal note, we want to be contributors at the forefront of innovation in clinical trials because we can have a direct impact on people's lives.
That's nice. And then Vasu, I'd also like to hear your perspective on the same question. What motivated your involvement so early?
Sure, thank you, Eleanor. So IntelliNotion is actually a platform that provides structured content management and structured authoring capabilities for documents, including the protocol. So it's a natural fit for us to expand the information collection and then digital flow of that information into the documents. The study design, development and the study design in a digital way to be able to capture that and automate the generation of protocol and other documents was a natural fit for us. This is something we've been talking to with several of our clients who've expressed interest. They are aware of the work that Transcelerate's been doing for a while. So we welcomed the opportunity to participate. It gave us an opportunity as well to really leverage some of the domain expertise that and the thought, the group thinking that brought together some of the architectural and strategic approaches Transcellerate's put forward in their white papers. And subsequently in some of the activities that Bill described. So, it was a really great opportunity for us. It also, some of the initiatives around aligning with the CDISC USDM standards and the, implementation of that standard within the SDR initiatives was something that's directly applicable to what we're doing, and we can leverage some of that from the group thinking. So that's really our goal, is to leverage what you folks are doing and augment our capabilities to be able to create and flow that information just as the vision sets out.
That's actually really nice. It's nice to hear there's certain synergies in terms of augmenting what we know and innovation and building from that. So I'd actually like to hear from one of our member companies, and Nusheen, heads up, I'm going to reach out to you here for this, but because you've been on DDF for a while, but also of the panelists here, you're actually one that's closest to being a potential end user of a digital flow solution. So given the work that you've done on DDF so far, and what do you feel is the most important, or what is most exciting from your perspective?
Thanks, Eleanor, for the question. So given the way the industry works, it's an environment that's less than ideal to achieve optimal outcomes. I believe DDF would allow us to be more efficient in our collaboration across functions within companies. Many of the components which we currently perform manually would be automated, and that would allow us more time and focus to spend on important aspects such as the reuse of clinical trial data beyond the primary purpose that we collect it, for example, deep insight research for future drug discovery, AI, and opportunities to collaborate across the industry, across different companies, such as small startup companies, universities, academia, and other sponsors. So the DDF SDR framework and USDM would allow the automation of data flow from the protocol to downstream and upstream systems bidirectionally. In other words, automation of data flow and interoperability of systems that would introduce quality, time, and cost efficiency. And then for sponsor companies within the current landscape, we spend a lot of time manually setting up and conducting a clinical trial. And when it comes to the actual determination of data collection, data quality, and data analysis, it's a time-consuming and resource-intensive process. And it can often involve rework, because when we change something in one system, we have to manually update it in another system. So this prolongs the overall process that ultimately impacts the delivery of new medicines to patients. So by minimizing the manual aspect of moving data across systems and the setting up of each individual system as a standalone in the clinical trial process, it would leave us more room and time for innovation and complex problem solving. And in addition, trials are generally more complex in their design, and the addition of this complexity makes it difficult and time consuming to maintain efficiency and quality with the manual data flow. So in essence, I believe the DDF framework would allow for the manual processes to be simplified via automation. So Vasu, if I could ask you this question, given the work you've done in DDF, what do you feel is important, and what is it about DDF that excites you?
I think there are a few things from our perspective that is very interesting and exciting in our continued journey for automation. Currently, we do, as I mentioned, we do have a structured content platform, and we do have some automation to automate the protocol generation process. But some of the ability to build this study design capability to be able to leverage more intelligent ways to compile that design using, reuse from existing studies or standard libraries, or using, artificial intelligence to compile and suggest designs. If, our interest is in really to expand what we do today in terms of automation and provide that continual automation into the documents, that's very interesting for us, and I think for a number of our clients as well. The other aspect of this is, downstream automation. If we can contribute the design elements to the SDR, for example, and and in future as SDR evolves, to be able to, be notified of any design changes that are made by other systems back into the document, and our tracking and tracing that we maintain in our systems can be used to notify and alert document owners of design changes, whether it's made within our platform in the study design or in future external to our system as well. So those aspects are very interesting to us, and I think it's the journey aligned with what Transcelerate's doing is a very good fit for our vision as well.
Vasu, or Frederick, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So there's some buzz and excitement around certainly the innovation that's coming to the table, but I think specifically for what DDF then brings is the approach to the whole thing. And then finally, where we want to get at is value for sponsors. So if I take each of these in terms of when it comes to innovation, for me personally, it's been a long track over something like the last 10 years to start working on applying clinical data standards. I've been a couple of years on the CPT team under Rob DeKiko, and there was really a buzz when that CPT got developed and actually made it to be accepted by the industry as well. And then more broadly, with Neurocore to formulate that vision of a digitalized clinical development platform that can take us away from the current document-centric processes. So DDF has this slogan, bring down the document barrier. Bill said earlier, another slogan, something like unlock the data or the information. So that's definitely the innovation part of it. Now that's something we can work on our own as well. I think what DDF then specifically, or Transcelerate, can bring to the table is that it can bring or highlight the interaction that it needs between people, process, and technology to actually implement the technology and the innovation, make it successful with the sponsors. So that all then plays to bringing awareness about all of this, promote the vision across the industry, rally stakeholders, and there's many, there's sponsors, there's regulators, there's SDO solution providers, and then have DDF rally this whole community towards that common goal. And then maybe finally, around value, I think if a digitalized clinical development combined with good clinical data standards and protocol standards, when properly implemented, we can certainly realize faster study setup times for individual trials, but also on a broader scale, and maybe extending that to a clinical development program to have the time to market for products really speed up as well. And then with a combination of standards and digitalized study design, I think we can expect that sponsors can create more targeted study designs, specify more consistent, say, objectives and endpoints, eliminate avoidable and costly amendments, and then certainly also achieve a higher degree of downstream automation.
Thank you, Frederick. Then, and actually back to you, Nushin. We heard some really good benefits there that I could certainly buy into. I would like to hear again from your perspective as somebody who could be potentially an end user and also who's a member company.
So some of the benefits I see in adopting DDF would be that it would break down barriers to industry collaboration, because we will have a universal framework and that would allow member companies to share their data via automation and interoperability between one company system and another. If you take, for example, the current pandemic, this necessitated unprecedented phenomenal collaboration between so many different sections, groups, and companies. If we'd had a universal framework, it might have allowed for automation and interoperability of clinical trial data flow, and that might have introduced further efficiencies, simplified the process, and maybe allowed for speedier outcomes.
And over to you, Todd. I don't think I've asked you any questions yet. So what do you see as the benefits from your perspective?
So I kind of echo what Nasheen was saying. I think we all agree bringing a drug to market is a very complex process. And there's many opportunities to leverage technology throughout. But one side effect, or maybe even consequence of this, is that there are somewhat fragmented offering when it comes to vendor solutions. And so I think one of the biggest benefits that I see in adopting DDF is it's unifying on a common data model all of the vendors and participants in the industry. So it becomes a point of reference for vendors to align on, which facilitates some of the things, the benefits that the other panelists have been talking about: downstream automation, better study designs, leveraging more of the latest and greatest technology like machine learning to be able to aid in the process of creating a study design. And I think that the common data model essentially provides a common structured reference of data that allows us to share in that data and share in the software development. So I think ultimately the DDF bridges the gaps between all of these vendor solutions with that common data model, and it creates a rising tide that lifts all boats.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry about the mix-up with the name. I'm going to slightly change topics here, and we're going to go a little bit onto the more technical side, if you will, and the solution approach here, where we'll focus a bit on the USDM and the SDR. And so there, I'm going to start out with you, Vasu, to discuss what potential you see as a tech vendor in this current solution.
Yes, just echoing what Tom was saying, I think one of the key technical benefits is aligning with the USDM implementation as a standard. I think, for us, it gives us a reference that we can use, a reference model that we can use in our implementation. Additionally, in terms of data exchange, we don't, we can forego all of the translations that might need to happen if we have different, different schemas that we use across systems and things like that. So we see a fair amount of advantage there in being able to leverage a standards approach to our solution. Additionally, the big advantage we have is that some of the design patterns and things that are being evolved out of this, team discussions and collaboration is helpful for us to be able to leverage some of that thinking and that vision and the common design patterns that arise from these discussions. So from a technical solutioning perspective, this collaboration, the innovation that the Transcelerate team members and the Transcelerate team brings to the table is a huge, huge stepping stone for, I think, vendors like ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that creates a lot of potential for tech vendors like us.
Yeah, we're not thinking, on our own. We have a group and a platform to go to with either ideas that others come to the table with, or we have that we can bring to the table and get feedback to see if that's, it's a good approach from an overall strategic perspective, and that's very, very, that's a huge benefit, and that's really actually very helpful.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It creates a common foundation for complementary companies to work together. So, when we talk about benefits and, how we can all kind of, benefit from what DDF is doing in terms of sponsors, as Frederick mentioned, but also the vendors. Like I said, this common foundation for complementary companies to work together manifests in very obvious ways, but also unknown ways. The fact that DDF is open source means that we can leverage work done by the community. So, as a startup like us, that's a huge benefit, being able to leverage open source technology, certainly in terms of cost, and also, leveraging the community efforts. So some of the use cases articulated as part of the project, like a study builder feeding study design information downstream to an EDC, it clearly illustrates the value of DDF. But also, since it is open source, I really think that we'll see it being used in ways that we haven't even thought of yet, which will be an indication of true innovation. Frederick, I'm curious what you think about some of the potential that you see for tech vendors and with DDF.
Yeah, so we had kind of, I would say, two types of benefits, starting with the DDF hackathon at the time, where Transcelerate helped to spread out awareness and help sponsors to think about this, to start embracing change, etc., and thinking about different ways of working. So that specifically gave us confidence in investing long-term in building these solutions. So we've been building with, the substantial development team for a couple of years now in these things. So it takes a lot to develop these solutions and a lot of investment. So we need that confidence that we are going on the right track. I think specifically with SDR, now we're going a step further, as you have hinted, where standards and interoperability are now key objectives. So that's great value, not only just for customers to reduce vendor lock-in, but I think vendors themselves don't actually have value in vendor lock-in. So I think it is great that we can build this common repository, and by doing that, decrease the number of target systems that we have to integrate with. So I'm just going to give an example. If we build a study design solution and a protocol platform, but then say we want to use that structured data to automate the EDC build downstream, what we have to do today is to build a connector for each target EDC system. And so that's a lot of work to do. So now we have to make decisions like which EDC systems do we target out of the box. And then we might hit upon a customer that says, but we have this EDC system and now we have to develop even more. So with SDR as kind of an intermediary between that, that's gonna reduce for us the number of point-to-point integrations that we have to do. And so that helps us to free up development time to focus on the actual product that we want to build. So that's for us certainly a huge gain as a vendor.
Thanks. So we've heard a bit about the value that a DDF solution could provide not only to us in the pharma industry, but also tech vendors and society in general. I think we'll take a bit of a zoom out and look a bit at the longer term. We've actually had some inquiries about sustainability and utilization of DDF. So I'd like for you, Todd, if you could give us a few words about how DDF will work after the MVP launch. What's going to happen next?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's really important. And just to give a bit of context, I'm leading the governance sub-team. So we are sort of busy thinking through how can we set up all of the right ingredients to make sure that DDF solution can indeed become a sustainable part of the ecosystem that we all work in. I mean, as you can appreciate, the minimum viable product will have a fairly limited scope. So the first job that we need to do in order to set up the circumstances is to continue to build out the DDF, the USDM, and the DDF solution to make sure that we can realize some of the exciting potential that you've heard about today. When it comes to setting up the circumstances to move to sustainability, we're thinking a lot about three different components. One is ongoing engagement with CDISC, and CDISC kind of sort of continuing to develop the USDM and the APIs and the other components of the USDM data standard. And that data standard will be coming sometime after the public review period later this spring. The next thing will be to move the DDF solution and which means the study definition repository and the reference implementation into a place where people can see it and engage with it and start to use it, including having a lot of the code posted up on a GitHub site. And then also just as importantly, and perhaps more importantly, continuing to engage with all of the different stakeholders in the community, the sponsors, the standard setting organizations, the systems providers, and hopefully at some point even the health authorities as well, to make sure that we develop a broad community of people who see the potential and who are willing to participate in realizing that potential of the solution that we're trying to set up. Now, we don't think that any of those things is going to happen by accident, which is why we're sort of working with great sort of intentionality in terms of putting the right ingredients in place, really inviting input from trying to be as transparent as possible through webinars like this and through ongoing sharing opportunities, and trying to make sure that we have the right people who are engaged in the discussion to help us build this out and to realize the full potential of the solution.
And actually, when you talk about governance, I think in long-term viability and so on, that leads me to think about open source. And I know it's one of your favorite topics. So I'd actually like to hear some of your thoughts on using open source technologies or form for an initiative such as this.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about open source in this particular space, partly because we're talking about the life sciences space, but also partly because we're talking about standards governance, interoperability, data standards governance as well. And maybe I'll just take a step back for just a second and just to be clear what open source software is and how it's different from proprietary type software as well. So open source software is software where anyone can inspect the software, they can modify the software, they can enhance the software, and they could even incorporate elements of open source software in their own larger proprietary applications if they want to. And users have permission to use that open source software any way they want. That's quite different from how we normally work in pharma, and pharma has been relatively slow compared to other industries to adopt open source software, partly because of concerns about sharing potentially proprietary information, but I think also probably equally, if not more so, because of concerns because, open source sounds like it might be a little chaotic, and we've all been brought up to believe that, the most important thing we can do is validation. We're very concerned for good reasons with software validation, and the two sound like they might be mutually exclusive, but they really are not. And because of things like R and Python movements and those kinds of things, pharma has become a little bit more comfortable with open source, and we're seeing much more engagement with it. So despite the fact that we have been slow, we are coming around. But that having been said, the DDF solution will present a couple of unique challenges, particularly because we're talking about that interoperability standard. So interoperability standards, by their very nature, they need to be fairly stable. And on the other hand, open source is inviting sort of ongoing collaboration. So we know that as part of the governance processes that we build around the DDF solution, there's going to need to be a fairly rigorous assessment step, I guess, with all of those contributions to make sure that things are properly regulated in terms of what will affect the data standard itself, the components of the data standard itself, versus what will affect some of the interoperability pieces around things like the APIs, the extensions, and the adapters as well. So the success of DDF will depend on its adoption by systems providers, as well as the awareness among the study sponsors. But working in the open like that is a bit new for us. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we are sort of making it as easy as possible, both for sponsors as well as systems providers, which has a lot to do with making the right decisions around licensing, around how we govern the standards and how we govern the contributions. So we're doing a lot of work on that, but I do think that open source has a big space in our world. And I'm curious to hear the perspective of a systems vendor as well. So maybe I'll throw it to Tom, the same question to Tom.
Yeah, thanks. And I love that we're having this conversation. I think open source is just it quite literally has changed the world. And so it's really important. It's an important part of the technology ecosystem. In my career, I've been a contributor and benefactor of open source technology. Certainly at Trials AI, we're leveraging some open source technology. And as the DDF becomes available, again, that's open source. There's been wildly successful community-driven projects like Linux, Git, Kubernetes. And then to your point, Todd, there are times when without proper leadership and adoption, projects can go haywire. And so there is a little bit of that volatility. But the promise of open source is to provide better quality, more secure technology through community-driven, and you could say, peer-reviewed efforts. And that totally applies to life sciences and projects like DDF. They're essential components to facilitating innovation in the industry. That being said, it's equally essential that any open source project has the proper backing, support, leadership, and that's kind of what Transcelerate's in the position to do. So it feels like we've got kind of the right combination of, making this available to the community to kind of produce and manifest those great qualities that open source can generate, and at the same time, have that governance and quality assurance. So it's exciting.
And I'll just step in and say thank you to all of you guys for your thoughts and sharing your perspectives on this. I hope all of you listening in have got a better understanding of what the Digital Data Flow Initiative is about, the progress that we've made so far, and the value that it can bring wherever you're sitting and around in this industry. I can see we actually have a question or two in the chat. Please be aware, we will get that updated and posted on our FAQ, which you can find on our Transcelerate DDF Solutions webpage. If you have any other questions, please go ahead and post them there, and we'll get back to you. And thank you very much to our panelists for the very interesting thoughts and joining us. It was really interesting listening. And thanks to all of you guys who are on the call and listening.